Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Science Podcast. I'm Penny Lewis, a neuroscientist specializing in sleep and memory and the presenter of this show. This is the podcast where we talk to experts about all aspects of sleep, from dreaming and sleepwalking to what sleep does for our brain and our body, and how we can get more out of our sleep. Today, we're going to tackle age. At least we're going to ask the interesting question of how sleep changes as we age. With me is Professor Rebecca Spencer, who leads the Som-Neuro Lab at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's spent many years studying how sleep changes across the lifespan, from infant to old age. And Becky, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. I'm excited to do this.
I am excited to ask you lots of questions and learn about this, particularly because I know that you have been focusing on infants a lot recently, and my infant is now a toddler, but still there's a lot that I can learn from you, I'm sure. So I thought maybe we could start with just some general questions about how sleep changes across the lifespan. Maybe you could give us an overview.
I think most people's observation that a little infant and the little kids, they sleep a ton. And you see just from a newborn and through that first year, they have a lot of sleep. And then it just goes down and down and down into adolescence. By adolescence, you start seeing sleep times that are more similar to adults. And then through adulthood, there's some stability. I'd say it's a lot based on how we choose to live our lives, the variability you'll see through adulthood, but it's somewhat stable until you start to see these declines again in the 40s and 50s, and then it can continue to go down through 65 to 70, and then you can see it really bifurcate. Some will get extreme hypersomnia, and then some will get insomnia and just shorter sleep versus longer sleep in the really old age. So that's very notable. The other thing that I think is very notable about how sleep changes across the lifespan is just how variable it is across people changes a lot. So in newborns, if we look at the error bars around what sleep duration is, it's huge, right? So you could say anything from like 10 hours to 20 hours is normal for a young infant. That is such a huge range. It's not even helpful to have those norms. But those big error bars come together as we get into childhood. And then in adults, there's certainly a range, but it gets narrower and narrower. But then it gets wider again back into old age. You can see this great variability across individuals where you'll have some that are really short sleepers and some that are really long sleepers. So they kind of spread out again once you get into older adulthood.
That's super interesting. I didn't know about the bifurcation in old age. Have people studied the relation of that to kind of longevity or disease or dementia? I mean, you said that some people will have hypersomnia, so they're sleeping much, much more. Are they more healthy? Do we know?
No, actually, you can see, and particularly in older adults, you'll see that it can be, so both long sleep and short sleep can be related to morbidity. So it looks like they can possibly be for bad reasons. Like you could imagine somebody that's sleeping a lot, it's often a marker of ill health. And so it could be a sign that something it's trying to maybe do a lot of repair for an underlying reason that we might not always know. But that's why in general, it's not thought to be great to be at those extremes, even though we do tend to see that you've got quite a range and that people are either getting insufficient sleep, which we kind of more commonly talk about, or are getting kind of really high amounts of sleep. And when they get those high amounts of sleep, the other thing to note throughout the lifespan is when is sleep occurring, right? So a lot of those older adults that are getting a lot of sleep, it's also getting distributed more across the day. So that's a person that might be sleeping from 8 a.m. to 5 a.m., but then have a very long 1 or 2 naps in the middle of the day. And that's where I always find some of these parallels between older age and childhood to be super interesting.
And does the parallel extend to the kind of thinking about whether it's healthy or not? You said that in kids, the time spent in infants, the time spent asleep could vary from 20 hours to 10 hours. Does that mean that 20 hours might be unhealthy, or are they maybe premature, or do we know why?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't know that we know as much about why sleep duration varies so much in little kids. Sometimes it's a health thing. Sometimes there's reasons they can't sustain caloric intake enough to be able to sleep longer. And so that's often the child that when they're awake, they're often very fussy. But I don't know that we can really understand why there's such a huge range in the really young kids. I do think in the super young infants, the neonates, some of it is those infants that are really just trying to figure out how to sleep and wake and how to be able to get enough calorie intake to be able to sleep for longer periods of time. So I think it's a little confounded in those super young kids. But yeah, it's a good question, and really understanding some of this is work for our future students.
I think there must be something quite important going on there, because I think we probably agree that the sleep is doing something. They're not just sleeping gratuitously. So they're sleeping because they need that sleep. And so the question of why some of them need it more than others. I mean, I take the point that some of them they're not getting the calories, or they may have some pain that wakes them up. Could be other things. And that's true in the older people as well, I guess. So that's another kind of parallel.
The other parallel I would say is that the brain is developing at really different rates. And so how quickly they're able, for instance, to stabilize a circadian rhythm and get longer bouts, and consolidated bouts are probably better than a lot of short bouts as we think about that in adults, right? Like we think about how one big chunk of sleep is more efficient than multiple chunks of sleep. And so you can imagine in a little one who maybe has more consolidated sleep, so into fewer chunks, their sleep is probably more efficient. And so they're probably able to get away with less sleep. So I do think it's related to brain development in the little ones versus in the older adults. It's probably related to brain degeneration. So you can imagine how some of these things are kind of coming about for opposite reasons, which is interesting.
Do you know anything about the circuits that might be developing that would particularly require this? There's certainly one idea that it's the circuits maintaining the sleep itself that need to develop in order to get the efficient sleep. But there's also the kind of general impact of sleep on, many areas of the brain that are nothing to do with maintaining or generating sleep.
I think you're spot on. I think it's both. So I think that there's certainly the circuits underlying how we distribute our sleep. So when our circadian rhythm circuits are developing, brainstem is developing, all of that is coming into place. But I also think that we know that learning can change sleep. And so how rich the day is and how much is acquired across the day is processed during sleep. So there is something about how the whole brain is developing. How is the whole brain taking in information across the day? That has to be related to sleep. So that's where some of our work on naps is related to this, is that we would say that some of those memory areas of the brain that are getting challenged with all this learning that has to occur, that's how it's related to how frequently they're napping, is how much can the brain handle before it has to pause and unload things. So that's where I think there's also a relationship to not just sleep-related areas of the brain, but even these development of these cognitive areas of the brain are relevant as well.
And I think our listeners will mainly be familiar with the idea that sleep is important for memory and consolidating memories. But there's a whole literature about how that memory consolidation and sleep is different in kids than in adults. I mean, I don't know how much that's been studied in infants. That's tough to do. But can you comment on those kind of differences at all?
Well, I'll comment first by saying that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at and tease apart some of these ideas. So one of the ideas is this concept of memory consolidation really requires the hippocampus, the way we talk about it at least. And the idea is memories come into the brain. In the short term, they're in the hippocampus. And then with a bout of sleep, those memories are replayed and then shuffled out to the cortex. And that's what we as adult sleep researchers really rely on as our explanation for where the sleep benefit on memory comes from, right? So that's a model, though, that requires a developed hippocampus, a healthy and developed hippocampus. And some developmentalists would say the hippocampus isn't really sufficiently developed until they give the window of 18 to 24 months. And so there's a prediction that memory consolidation would be different before that age than it is after that age. And that's kind of a confusing prediction because there's certainly a lot of researchers that have shown that there is sleep-dependent memory consolidation before 18 months. There's now been a number of studies. We've done some work with deferred imitation task. Other people have used more of like language learning tasks in those young ones. And we know sleep is beneficial then. So it gets a little tricky to tease apart, but is it coming from a different place, right? It's possible that sleep is still beneficial before 18 months, but it's not using the hippocampus to do so. And that idea relies more on synaptic downscaling. So it's possible that you could still have a sleep benefit before 18 months, but that's just coming about from brain-wide synaptic downscaling with sleep versus after that 18 to 24-month window is when you have the systems consolidation that we more commonly talk about. So we're doing longitudinal studies in our lab now to where we can really follow a kid from 16 months to 31 months to see if we see any evidence of a change in what memory consolidation looks like before 18 months to after 24 months. So hopefully we can say more about that in the future.
Does this have anything to do with the concept of infantile amnesia? So I remember learning about this, this is why we don't remember much from when we were tiny infants. And this presumably is because of the maturation of the hippocampus that is just not ready to retain those memories.
I think this is a great question because the idea of infantile amnesia is a little bit of what brought me together with Tracy Riggins, who's a hippocampal development researcher at the University of Maryland. She was interested in, there's huge variability in the development of the hippocampus and of memory, and it's in this like 3 to 5 age range, which is right around when, at least in theory, infantile amnesia, you kind of come out of infantile amnesia around that window. And how do we predict who's going to come out when, right? She was interested in that question as part of what brought us together is like, how can we explain these huge individual differences, even just in memory and hippocampus development? And could it be sleep is what we've been wondering. I will say that a lot of the theories had relied on it being ought to be about, is the hippocampus developed enough? I'm not a developmentalist by training, so I like to just thank all of the people around me. I really think that field has done a good job of showing the hippocampus is developed. I personally don't think it's necessarily that the hippocampus is not sufficiently developed. I do not think that's a good explanation of infantile amnesia. And so there's some other theories that exist around like what is infantile amnesia? Where is it coming from? My postdoc, Lindsay Mooney, worked with Simona Getty, who's another one of these brain developmentalists. And she has the idea that it's more of like the scaffolding isn't developed enough. It's not that you don't have necessarily the developed hippocampus, but you don't have the whole network of concepts to place new concepts into in order to hold on to it. But this gets back to maybe underlying your question is that related to sleep at all? I certainly think so because, and how I think is something for all of us to figure out. But I believe that hippocampal amnesia reflects a certain amount of filtering of memories, right? I mean, it's got to be saying this little kid has done all of these different experiences, but somehow you're able to remember how to write letters, which you learn in that age range, but you don't remember your third birthday party, which also occurred in that age range. And so there's probably a good amount of information that's getting sorted in terms of what is going to get stabilized and held long term and what is maybe that's nice in the short term. And I'm going to pull out kind of maybe generalities that you learned at that birthday party. Maybe you learned what balloons are, you learned what cakes are, something. You put that onto kind of broader concepts. And so I think there's some filtering going on of those early memories. And we know sleep is really good at that. So we know we can stabilize the veridical memories during slow wave sleep, but we also seem to think that it looks like REM sleep is a good filter. So we can say, okay, save everything. Here's what to keep working on when you keep going back into slow wave sleep. So I do think that sleep potentially plays a role here in contributing to maybe the production of synapses related to some aspects of the memory, but also the reduction of synapses during REM for maybe the areas that aren't worth saving. That's my sleep lens. That's my sleep bias that I think sleep has something to do with it, but I think we've got a long way to go to really pin down what that is.
So there's a lot in what you just said, and I want to unpack it and make sure that I got it all. The first thing is you don't believe that the infantile amnesia is due to the hippocampal development, but instead it may be due to the scaffolding, which is about whether there's enough semantic knowledge, so that enough knowledge of how the world works in order to link in the new memories into that and retain them long term. And to me, that would make sense in context of another thing that you said, which is that the hippocampus is kind of done developing by about 2 years old, whereas the time frame when infantile amnesia stops being an issue is more like 4 to 5 years old. So that's actually quite different in time. And that's where you're saying the hippocampus is mainly developed anyway for those last 4 years.
I would say the hippocampus has very protracted development, though, and so it's continuing to develop into 5 or 6 or beyond. It's just some of these theories, and I'll give credit to Rebecca Gomez, for instance, has a nice paper that really points to 18 to 24 as being kind of a magic moment when it's developed enough. But infantile amnesia has been related to that continued development that even occurs after 2, and that's how it's been at least try to point it at. The hippocampus is still developing then. But for instance, Lindsay Mooney and Simone Getty have some nice work where they're doing functional imaging of 2-year-olds, which to me is like ridiculously brave, and showing the hippocampus is functional for recent memories. And that is, to me, a really impressive data to support like that hippocampus is more than just develop. It's doing a pretty good job of memory encoding and recall like we would expect it to. So that's where I would say it's certainly developed enough to make it be unlikely to be the suspect for all of infantile amnesia. But is it maybe just a piece of all of this memory development and filtering that needs to go on during that age when you have the whole brain is choosing what to prune away? That's where I think you've got a bigger role for sleep, is more in that later. And it's not just about the hippocampus, but what are we pruning across the brain? And that's where I think there might be a sleep-related role.
And that would be why you think that kids of that age need so much sleep. Is that right? And maybe the distribution of the sleep stages is a bit different in kids of that age than in adults.
Yeah, I certainly am convinced that the high amount of sleep that you see in little kids is related to that high amount of learning that they're doing. And you could take that a step further and say the richness of the sleep that little kids have and how much slow wave sleep they have, I think is reflective of that high amount of learning that they're doing during the day.
I mean, just kind of building on that, in the little kids, I know you've also worked on what sleep might be doing for their emotional processing. So that's kind of the other side of the memory coin, isn't it? Could you tell us a bit about that?
When we first started doing these studies of sleep and memory consolidation in little kids, we would go into preschools and say, hey, do you mind if we keep these kids awake one day and get them to nap another day? And interestingly, a lot of the teachers would be like, are you crazy? You're going to keep these kids awake during nap time? And they often had these they will be wild, they will be crazy, they will be grumpy. They had very emotional descriptions of what these kids would look like. But we do have this kind of intuition that a napless kid might be a little wild and crazy. And frankly, my observation is just simply emotionally dysregulated, because I think one moment they're giddy and the next they're throwing a fit. So we've looked at whether sleep has a role in this emotional processing from 2 different ways. And our first was with a memory bias. And so what we were interested in is, does sleep consolidate emotional memories in these little kids as we knew that it did in adults? I'll say one reason that's a particularly interesting question scientifically is that in adults around that time, a lot of people were saying it's not just sleep, it's REM sleep in particular that was associated with emotional memory processing. And we knew these naps didn't have REM sleep. They were too short. So if REM was necessary, then these naps shouldn't do anything for emotion. But at the same time, we had the kind of colloquial observations that they do have something to do with emotion. So We looked to see whether sleep benefited emotional memories in these little kids. We've now used a couple different paradigms, but at first we used one where they were given neutral faces paired with emotional expression. So either this is Bob and he brought a ball to school, or this is Bill and he gave everybody cookies today. So something that was very positive. Or we could have some that were, and he took everybody's cookies today, something very negative. And we looked at their memory for these faces and whether it was biased by that emotional category. And we found that the naps didn't show a benefit right away, which I think is interesting. But if we went back to them the next day, there was a big benefit to having napped after learning the prior day. So this is a delayed benefit of the nap. So immediately after the nap, there wasn't really a big benefit on the memory. But if we look at it the next day, if they had napped the prior day, it had given enough of a boost to those memories that the next day you're doing much better on those emotional memories if you had sleep following learning.
Did they also nap on the second day? So was it that they were napping every day, or they just had that one unusual nap and then you're checking the next morning before when they would nap, or?
Yeah, so in the paradigm, they learned these at about 11 in the morning, and typically they would nap between 1 and 3. So we either had them nap between 1 and 3 or we kept them awake between 1 and 3. The next day, we went back to them at 11 in the morning again. So 24 hours after they had encoded, but before their next nap. So it's not about that next day's nap. It's more about maybe what overnight sleep continued to work on it. So one way to think of it is if you had napped after learning, it had maybe preliminarily processed it. So it was something about, maybe tagging it or preserving it or having it temporarily packaged up so that when you went to sleep later, it did get prioritized and did get a memory consolidation, a delayed benefit that way. We actually found a similar pattern in the behavior when we look at a motor learning task in kids. We also found a delayed benefit. So it's not necessarily just about emotion that we have a delayed benefit. And it's something that I think you've seen in some of your data, and I've been intrigued by why. It's, why do these tasks get a delayed benefit, but other tasks get an immediate benefit? As much as we like to talk about memory consolidation being this tidy little package that occurred overnight in just this single sleep out, I think memory processing is a more prolonged process than we typically talk about. And this is just an example of how that was a prolonged process of the memory. We had subsequently done a study in the emotional memory task that showed that even though there wasn't an immediate benefit to that performance, it did make the memories stable to resistance. So if after the nap, we were to first give them an interfering task, showed them brand new faces, for instance, that should get in the way of that memory. But the nap was enough to keep it from interfering. So there was some kind of short-term protection that it was doing, even though we couldn't see it in the behavior right away. Another way we've looked at it is, let's say you have a child that takes a nap, and we really want to get to just how emotional they are afterwards versus if they stayed awake during nap time. The task that we used for that is called a dot probe task. What you do is you present two faces, one on either side of the screen, and one of the faces will be neutral and the other one will be emotional. Those two faces are presented simultaneously and then they disappear. And when they disappear, there'll be a star behind one of the faces. And all you have to do is press a button to tell me which side was the star on. Super simple task that these little kids can handle. But what we're secretly doing is looking at how their attention is biased by the emotion. If you're a sleep-deprived little preschooler, you're going to be more attentive to those emotional faces than the neutral faces. So you're just slightly, ever so slightly, more likely to be looking at that emotional face, which makes you quicker to respond when the star is behind the emotional face. And so that gives us a measure of how distributed is the child's attention to emotional stimuli in space. And that's what I think is going on in the napless child. But if we do the same thing for our child that's just taken a nap, they're like cool as a cucumber. So their attention is exactly equal for the neutral and the emotional face. And they distribute their attention equally. So they're just as fast to respond regardless of which side that star is on.
Do you also use happy faces in there, or are all the emotional ones negative?
We've used both, and we actually see that they have a bias towards both the positive and the negative. In this paradigm, it's super interesting because particularly having a bias to negative is associated with poor outcomes, but there's actually also some cases where you see poor outcomes associated with a bias towards positive as well. So they're both considered, you want to be neutral regardless of which the emotional pairing is. But in this case, we saw that they were biased to anything that was emotional over the neutral cases.
I just want to wrap up the comment on what you were talking about before you went to the dot task. The possibility that you raised that the nap is helping to, package things up so that they can then be processed later in the subsequent night of sleep, so that if they have had a nap, then 24 hours later, they deal with it better the next morning. To me, that's fascinating, and I agree. There are lots of things in the memory literature which would suggest a similar kind of thing, and there we tend to say it's been tagged, and then it's going to get replayed across the night of sleep, and the memory will get strengthened at that time. What I was wondering when you were explaining this is there a memory component in this task? Because you're looking at how they respond to things emotionally at the time. Are they seeing those same things, on both days, or are they just seeing them on the second day? So there's no memory component, but it's just about how well emotionally regulated they are at that time.
So for the dot probe task, it would be really hard to say that there's a memory component, but I'll tell you how I put these two things together. So first, we know that the emotional memory consolidation task, the performance was associated with slow wave activity. So how much of that delta activity was there in sleep predicted how much emotional memory consolidation there would be. And we also saw how much slow wave activity you had in the nap was related to how much of a bias or neutrality of your bias you had in the dot probe task. So they both seem to be associated just with slow wave activity, which to me suggests they share a common mechanism. And the mechanism that I've proposed is that when we sleep, we consolidate the emotional memories from earlier in the day, if it's a nap, or just our whole day experience if it's overnight sleep. So now when I have an emotional challenge, these emotional faces, for instance, now when I have an emotional challenge, it's not coming on to a slate that's already loaded with a lot of emotional baggage, but it's coming at me with a clean slate. And now I can handle that emotional challenge better. I'm not as distracted by it. I'm more regulated in my response to it. So I do think that there is a relationship between consolidating our emotional memories and how we're emotionally responding afterwards.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it also leads nicely to this concept of distributed sleep in kids that I know you've worked on as well, because the idea that, maybe having one long consolidated sleep epoch is good, but actually maybe occasionally you need some shorter sleep epochs distributed through the day in order to package things up for this might be useful too. Is that how you think of it? Can you tell me a bit about the distributed sleep work?
We came upon this kind of accidentally, that when we look at, do kids consolidate memories over a nap? And we see, yes, indeed, they do. But we can then separate it out by, are they a habitual napper or not? Because if naps are beneficial to memory, why do we ever grow out of naps? Like, why don't we just keep doing it? And so we predicted that there was something different going on between those that are habitually napping. You can have the same age kid that is habitually napping and then look across the room and there'll be another kid at the exact same age that doesn't nap anymore. And we assumed that there was something different in terms of memory consolidation between these two groups. And what we found is that the naps are beneficial to memory for both of those groups. The naps protect the memory for a habitual napper just like they do for a non-habitual napper. But what changes is how detrimental it is to stay awake. So if I'm a habitual napper and you keep me awake during nap time, you see a huge loss, like catastrophic forgetting in the habitual napper when I keep them awake during nap time. But in the non-habitual napper, somebody that's naturally transitioned out of naps, you see that if I kept them awake during nap time, it doesn't really harm the memory too much. A little bit, but not much. So that's where we came up with this idea that there's something about how prepared the brain is for taking on more memories that relates to how frequently they're napping. And the idea is that if you had an underdeveloped hippocampus, and I'm just going to call underdeveloped or less mature small, even though I don't think it's necessarily small. But if I had a small hippocampus, I can only take on so much before I have to pause and let some stuff out. Otherwise, I'm going to get a lot of interference between the memories coming into the hippocampus because my hippocampus is small. So if I keep piling stuff in, it's all just going to get mumble jumbled. But if I have a more mature hippocampus, so let's think of that as a bigger hippocampus, I can take on more and more memories and they're not going to conflict with each other because I've got enough room. So I don't need to pause in the middle of the day and empty it out. And that's more adult-like. And that's why adults don't necessarily have to nap. We can nap and we get protection when we do, but we don't have this super catastrophic forgetting over staying awake like our really young habitual nappers do.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So there was one more study of yours that I found that really fascinated me with respect to sleep in kids. And that's the one about the fruit and vegetables and also the TV watching. Can you say a bit about how that influences their sleep and what you did?
Yeah, I mean, along the way, we've been interested in just, we're measuring sleep and hundreds of kids, and at this point we're probably up to thousands, and we are all of them, in addition to using polysomnography to look at what type of sleep they get, we use actigraphy. So we usually have about 2 weeks where we know exactly how much they were sleeping on a day-to-day basis. And then because we're opportunistic, we also give the poor parents a lot of questionnaires and give us a lot of insight into what these kids are doing on a day-to-day basis. We learn things like, are they bed sharing? We learn things about their TV exposure, their diet, and we're interested in of course, our baseline question was, are there other things that are explaining when they're napping besides just this brain development piece, but also just what affects their sleep in general. And what we saw with the TV watching, that first of all, that is just really striking is that there's something like 30% or more of the kids that had a TV in their bedroom. There's things that I think put that TV in the bedroom in other households. So sometimes it might be, we're a shift working family and I need the kid to stay in their room so that I can get a nap in the middle of the day, or I need that distraction for them. So there's some economic reasons that I actually think put that TV in the bedroom. I think there's certainly education reasons. So people that might not understand what the TV in the bedroom might be doing negatively, that I think puts the TV in the bedroom. There's also a few that were on the other end of the spectrum that, we got a new huge flat screen TV for the living room and the kid wanted it in his bedroom. And that way I can watch my football game while they're watching Blue's Clues or whatever they're into. So there's a lot of reasons that it ends up there. But what we found that was super fascinating is, first of all, having the TV in the bedroom, they were more likely to watch adult-like content before bed if they're watching it alone in their room. But you also see a delay in sleep onset time when there was simply that TV in the bedroom, and overall less sleep duration for those kids that had a TV in their bedroom. So it seems like such a simple thing, but at the same time, we don't often talk about it. And to me, I like to think of ways that we can support and improve the sleep of kids, and that certainly seems like something to be talking about and at least educating parents on of the impact of that.
Yeah, to me, it makes a lot of sense. I was more surprised by the fruit and veg study. That was surprising that it should have such an impact on sleep, but maybe you can comment on what that was and why.
Right. So we also asked about the frequency of fruit and vegetable intake, the frequency of fast food intake, and we saw a huge reduction in the amount of sleep that the kids got the more frequently they ate fast food. But you also see the huge improvement in how many hours of sleep they get if they eat more fruits and vegetables.
Were they maybe getting caffeine? Were they drinking sodas and getting caffeine? Or why do you think it was impacting their sleep?
Well, I do think that it was the quality of the foods that we get. And we know that in studies in adults that there's poor sources of calories for food, the worse you'll sleep. And in adults, we know that those are often foods that were eaten later in the day. And so that's one of the things we don't know in this particular study is what time of the day were they getting the foods too. So you often get those poor calorie sources of foods more distributed through the day, more often in the night versus the timing of the fruits fruits and vegetables. So it was probably more with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So I think that there's a lot more questions behind that we don't know the answer to be able to answer your question like, well, what is it about some fruits and vegetables? But I do think that overall they're getting probably some of those vitamins that we even say are better for our sleep. So I think that there's a lot behind that. And that too, I would say we need to do more work in that area.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it could well be that they're missing out on some of the proteins and vitamins and compounds that we know facilitate and promote sleep. And they might be also getting some things that interfere, like caffeine and other things. Yeah, interesting stuff. Okay, so let's move on from kids now to talk about some of your work in older people. I know it's not been your focus recently, but you certainly have, a big background on it. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you've done.
Well, I guess as my second study in this area was to accidentally find that older adults don't get the benefit of sleep on memory consolidation. What we were interested in there was simply what underlies the role of sleep on memory, and we wanted to be able to get to do a patient study in order to answer that question. And I was first testing my control group, and the control group were older just because the patients that we were looking to test often were individuals that had had a stroke or something that caused their lesion. And so the control group was older, between say like 50 and 80, pretty broad range. And we could not for the life of me replicate this finding from Matt Walker at the time, and I could not for the life of me replicate that. I had even re-replicated his results in the young adults and could not get the older adults to do it. That's when we just had to conclude, like, it's different in older adults. So that was happenstance. That was not what I was wanting to find. I just wanted to move on to my patient study. And so that's where we got started. And then I really began my independent research career with that finding in mind and tried to start teasing apart, but is it every task? Is it different? Does it differ by task? And now I think between our work and some other stuff that has come up in the field, I think we do generally agree that there's some difference, that it seems like certainly the benefit for sleep on declarative tasks in older adults seems to be stronger and more frequently present than the benefit of sleep on a procedural learning task. So like learning a sequence of finger movements is where it really seems to be detrimental in the older adults. So we've spent a lot of our work trying to tease these things apart, of trying to understand what tasks get a sleep benefit. We've also kind of a third category of memory. We think of declarative, procedural, and then as we've talked about with the kid work, we think of emotional as another kind of type of memory that could be distinct. And so we've also looked at how that changes in older adults. And the emotional task has been interesting because in young adults, you see really strong consolidation of negative memories and less so of positive memories. But in older adults, that seems to flip. So they show consolidation of positive memories with sleep, but less so negative memories. So we've been really interested in, given those behavioral distinctions, what underlies those behavioral distinctions in order to really understand this mechanism.
I think that's very adaptive that older people tend to strengthen positive rather than negative memories in their sleep. I wish that happened when people were younger as well.
I agree. I think the younger adults have a lot to learn from in those negative memories, but I'm glad to know as you get older that there will be this positive memory bias. And I will say that's true of already known to be true in memory encoding itself, so that we encode more positive memories with age and less negative memories. And so what we were finding is really a replication of that distinction in the consolidation process.
And you mentioned that in the older people, you don't have the strong sleep-dependent strengthening of procedural skills, so finger tapping, tasks, things like that. To me, that also resonates very strongly with anecdotal experience, because we know that it's harder for people as they age to learn those kind of skills. So this fits very nicely. It sounds like you're saying that maybe their declarative memory isn't so affected. And so word pairs, what you had for breakfast, these kind of things, maybe not so much.
That's right. And on those studies, we've really worked hard to try to tease apart initial encoding. So I don't want to say that older adults can learn declarative memories just fine. But if we train them really well with these declarative memories, and then have them sleep. This change in the memory over sleep is similar for older and young adults, meaning that they all might forget a little bit over a 12-hour interval, but if that 12-hour interval contained sleep, it was less forgetting than if they stayed awake. And it was the same amount, the same difference between those two conditions that young adults had. So yeah, the declarative memories do seem to still get a benefit of sleep. And I'll say that's what is super perplexing, is because as a field, associate that kind of memory consolidation with slow wave sleep. But slow wave sleep is obliterated by aging. I mean, we see some older adults that have just like a couple minutes of slow wave sleep. It's really, really just such a drastic change in sleep. And so that's, again, why we've been fascinated with how are they pulling this off in the face of such little slow wave sleep? Is it just that slow wave sleep becomes more efficient? Is it that it doesn't take much slow wave sleep? And I'm not here to give you the answer to that because we don't know. Our latest and kind of hot off the presses idea is if you make that memory strong enough, even for a procedural task, it does look like we can get consolidation. We've kind of really pushed this idea that an older adult doesn't engage the hippocampus as much in procedural learning tasks as a young adult. And so if we really, really strengthen the memory, then it becomes a bit more hippocampal. And it's possible that that minimal amount of hippocampus engagement is then what allows them to get a memory consolidation benefit. And so it might not be so much of how much slow wave sleep you necessarily get an older adult to have, but how strong is that memory in the hippocampus in order to even be amenable to that process.
So are you thinking of it as, because procedural memories are also processed by the striatum and the cerebellum and those areas, which I know you have done a lot of work on as well, but the hippocampus can be involved. Are you thinking of it as in maybe it's only the hippocampal component that really consolidates across sleep? Or are you thinking in sleep that is appropriate for younger people, somehow that sleep is impacting on the other circuits that I mentioned, the striatum, the cerebellum, the motor circuits? Whereas in older people, it needs to get into the hippocampus in order to consolidate. Or don't you know?
We don't actually fully know. I think that there's enough evidence, though, to support the first thing that you said. So there's now animal literature and human literature to suggest that hippocampus engagement is a minimum condition to get memory consolidation. So there's been some animal studies that show if you do a variant of the task that doesn't really engage the hippocampus, that there doesn't seem to be a memory benefit. That seems to be true in some of these really kind of quirky versions of motor sequence learning where I can make sure that it's not a hippocampal task. That doesn't seem to get a sleep benefit. And so in a young adult, even under basic conditions, they pretty quickly bring the hippocampus online for a motor sequence learning task. It doesn't take them too long to get from that kind of low-level striatal learning to some more high-level engagement in the hippocampus. And that hippocampus is maybe working hard to make contextual associations and starting to maybe explicitly be aware of the sequence and all of those things that the hippocampus can do. And I think a young adult can get to that point pretty early on in learning. So it doesn't take a lot for them to be able to get some sleep benefit. Versus an older adult, they're much earlier in that kind of evolution of the memory. And so that memory stays really low-level striatal cerebellar for longer. But if I maybe really push them on their motor sequence learning, I can get them to more engage the hippocampus and get them a sleep benefit. Does seem to be, we're starting to get some evidence that that's true.
And that fits in very nicely with the idea that, older people tend to rely more on their semantic memory. And I know it's another whole system. That's not what we're actually discussing, but, they're not tending to rely on their episodic declarative memory. You may need to push harder in order for them to use it. That's basically what you're saying. And that's the system where you're getting the more obvious, immediate kind of benefits of sleep. It's really interesting. So just to kind of follow it with one last thing, there are a lot of ideas flying around about aging and sleep and dementia. And I wondered if you have opinions on the relation between those things.
Yeah, so we've been interested in this. I'll say that we started out in some of this aging work arguing that what we're doing is really providing the baseline to make predictions of what would happen if we went into populations with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. And it's gotten so complicated to just try to understand what happens in healthy aging that we haven't really gotten into the unhealthy aging as we would like to. But I'll tell you a little of what we know is that those changes that happen from a young adult to an older adult in sleep, those are the same changes that you see from aging into unhealthy aging, healthy aging to an individual with Alzheimer's disease. It's just amplified. And so, yes, they have reduced slow wave sleep, but they have even more reduced slow wave sleep. They have reduced REM, but they have even more reduced REM. So I do think that our understanding of healthy aging is giving us that foot in the door to try to understand what's happening in Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment. We've had some specific interest in trying to work with individuals with Alzheimer's disease, and it's just been really hard to recruit them for our protocols because it's tricky and it's hard and it's, uncomfortable and agitating and all of those things that they really don't need. So I'll digress and say I think that's one reason we need better sleep recording technology is to even be able to reach some of these populations that just can't tolerate our sleep recording devices that we typically use. So we haven't gone there. I will say that I've learned a lot from that field, though, in terms of different possible ways that I think that these are tightly tied. I certainly believe that connection, but how much of their memory loss is associated to loss of sleep versus just simply loss of the neural integrity for forming the memories in the first place is a big nut to crack still.
Fair enough. Lots of work left for us to do in the next 20 years. So we've covered lots of really great material, Becky. Thank you very much. My final question would be, what should I have asked you that I haven't?
Oh, I love that. I guess that I always like your question of where is the field going or something. So I'll take one of your own questions. And what I've learned from the developmentalist is you really can't understand the process of development without longitudinal studies. And because development is about change. And so far, a lot of that development work has not been longitudinal. That's certainly what we're doing, but I can't say that we're covering it all. And then I would challenge the older adult field to do the same because really aging is about change. And change is messy. So looking cross-sectionally, as we've really been doing so far, is not going to provide us the sufficient information that we need to really understand age-related changes. And so every time I claim to be talking about age-related changes and I'm doing it cross-sectionally, we're not really capturing what we need to understand the aging process. So that's something that I hope that our field will kind of pick up on more. It's hard work, but I think now that we're understanding processes better, starting to get a grip of maybe the right tasks and the right methods, that hopefully that's something that the next generation can pick up on and do better in the future.
And it's a tough one because it requires very long studies and a lot of funding in order to conduct those. So it's hard to convince funding agencies, yes. Isn't it? Well, I think on that note, I will say thank you so very much for all of this information. And I really learned a lot from talking to you.
Yeah, Penny, this was fun to
do. You've been listening to the Sleep Science Podcast with me, Penny Lewis. Our guest today was Professor Rebecca Spencer of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Look out for our upcoming episode on computational modeling of what the brain does to memories while we sleep. From all of us here at the NAPS Lab in Cardiff, thanks for listening and sweet dreams.